Thanks, Ben. So, we're living through one of the great transitions of the history of humanity right now. In some ways, we are incredibly privileged to get to live through this, although we'll see how messy it ends up being. We're living through what we can call the end of the Enlightenment. We're living through the end of certainty as a structuring principle that we get to depend on. We're living through the rise of network culture and the network. And at this point, in some ways, it feels kind of trivially obvious to say, in this room at this point in time, that we're living through the rise of the network. But I don't think it's really obvious to a lot of people who aren't living inside that world just how deep that rise goes, just how profound of a disruption we're actually talking about. There's a great Rand paper that I reference sometimes called Tribes, Institutions, Markets, and Networks that talks about each of these as kind of fundamental structures which have evolved over different, kind of consecutively, fundamental ways in which humankind organizes itself. Not about the technical structure of the network, but about the human structure of the network. Once you have, for instance, a post-institutional society, a society where institutions exist, and you try to run a society without institutions in it, it doesn't work anymore because the existing tribal structures have adapted and modified and changed themselves, and the notion of what power and how organizations flow and work has shifted such that that society can no longer be functional without the new elements. As the network occurs, as the network evolves, that means that all of the existing power structures are changing. The definition of what power means, what power meant before the network, no longer holds, no longer will hold. My friend Quinn Norton talks about something called the agency fairy, which I love as a metaphor. The agency fairy has traditionally been this very sort of somber creature that alights on the shoulders of kings and the rich and whoever else and says, you matter. What you do matters in the world. Whatever choices you make, these decisions will echo through time. And at some point in the past few decades, the agency fairy got really, really, really drunk. And now the agency fairy is just sort of flitting around the room going, you matter, and you matter, and you matter. And there's no real externally visible logic to it. There's a logic, but it's a logic of a network. It's a logic of flow. It's not a logic which is predictable or legible from outside of that structure. There are still aspects which matter around access to resources, access to platform. These things do change things, but these things are not necessarily beholden to institutional structures. They're just in and of the resource themselves. This gets really interesting in a place like this when you start talking about what cultural production means, what the legibility of cultural production means, what the ability to produce culturally means. Ben said something really interesting at the ICA the other night in what was, kind of a ticketed shop floor debate for the net art community. If the restrictions of being an artist are too confining on the practice, well, just stop calling yourself an artist and keep doing whatever the hell you want to do. The age in which an institution could meaningfully really say much of anything about what art is, who gets to count, what art will actually echo, what art will have an impact, what art will define the future of culture is long gone. And this has been gone in some ways for a while with the fracturing that happened with postmodernism, but again, the depth of that fracture is only becoming obvious now. Networks do very interesting things to institutions and markets. Few of them are very pleasant for the institutions and the markets in question. Just ask your friends who work in the music industry how they feel about networks. Networks basically look at an institution and say, well, I like that bit over there. I like the kidney. And I think I'd like a little bit of that spleen. So I'm just going to get out a razor and I'm going to slice this thing open and I'm going to take out the bits that I want and I'm going to reassemble this into a homunculus that works the way the network would like it to work. And the institution doesn't necessarily get any choice in this for very long. The only choice that it has is what it can force the network to do by abusing it with its resources. This is not a good way to have the network like the institution and doesn't bode well for the future of that institution or the future of that market. This is interesting if you are part of a market around cultural production, say the art market. Because if you are, you're going to lose. The network has your children. Of course you're going to lose. Of course there's no chance that those institutions are going to last in a coherent way if they don't start responding to the network and if they don't become what the network wants them to work. You were dealing with a force of history. The arc of history is currently curving towards the network. It'll bend it back. You know, there will be a détente, but it will be a détente that is as much on the network's terms as it is on any other terms. So there is definitely a role for institutional structures in the future, if nothing else because networks are exceptionally bad at introspection. If you are on the internet, and I am speaking as much about cultural networks, but if you are on the internet and you stop passing packets, what is that called? That's called no longer being on the internet. Networks exist in a structure of flow and performance in the moment. As soon as you stop performing the protocol of whatever network you're no longer in the network. This makes it difficult for networks to introspect because introspection is not a function of flow. So, in some ways, the role of the institution can be as the introspective infrastructure for a network, but that position comes with certain requirements. Metcalfe's law says that the value of a network is the square of the number of nodes in the network. Metcalfe was the guy who invented Ethernet back in the 70s. If you have one fax machine, it's a curiosity. If you have 6 fax machines, they might be slightly useful in a few cases. If you have 1 billion fax machines and no other electronic form of communication, then they are an absolute necessity and everyone has to have one. But those people only see so much benefit from, even if they have to have one, they only see so much benefit from having that fax machine, from being part of that network. And if that fax cost them £2 to send, they probably see a lot less benefit than they do if it's free. So the value of a network is actually sort of the square of the upside value left on the table by the protocols of the network and the institutions that frame that network. So if, as an institution, you are interested in taking on the role, or if as a market you're interested in taking on the role of introspection, of a keeper of memory for the network, then you need to make sure that you do so in a way which leaves as much upside on the table as possible. You need to make sure that you do so in a way which lets the network actually flourish and understands that the position of the institution in the market is secondary to the network in this case. This doesn't bode well for painting prices.